The first speaker is Felice Cimatti from Università della Calabria. Cimatti is professor of philosophy on language, specialist of linguistics, but also I saw in the internet psychoanalysis, and a very interesting point for me is his investigation about animals and how
it's the subject of
exactly
my talk.
So Professor Cimatti wrote a lot of books, so I don't summarize them. You can find them on Amazon. And also quite well known in Italy because Professor Cimatti works at the Italian radio broadcasting with very famous and programs that I love very much, like Fahrenheit, for example, or Homine Profe. Professor Cimatti, if you want to start.
Okay. Allora, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm quite, I'm glad to be here, and I hope that my considerations about the question of animality could be useful for this conference. The title of my conference is Human Animality as the Unmaking of Transcendence. So the idea is that this quite unusual concept as human animality could be useful for the unmaking, the notion, the very general notion of transcendence that in this talk I consider the main problem. The question is how to unmake transcendence. I will read because it's much better. So in this talk, I would like to propose a form of expression that does not imply the presence of a subject that wants to express itself on the one hand, and that does not produce as its first and fundamental effect a separation between the one who expresses herself or himself and what is expressed on the other hand. So the question is how to avoid such a dualism. A separation between the one who expresses and what is expressed. It is a form of expression that does not produce any form of dualism. To put it another way, my aim in this talk is to imagine a kind of expression that, in its own making, somewhat unmakes itself. If, in the usual way, expression seems destined to produce separation and dualism, the kind of expression proposed in this talk aims at disabling what might be called the dualistic drive of expression. Every form of expression seems to imply a movement from the inner to the outer, as in the exemplary case of communicative expression, where someone intends to communicate his inner feelings or thoughts to someone else. The same seems to apply to artistic expression, where the so-called artist communicates his artistic intentions to a wider audience. Such forms of expression seem to imply a transcendent movement, because what was originally inside the one expressing himself is now outside him, in the so-called external space. In the end, such a movement of transcendence produces a dualism between an internal and an external real, between a subject and an object, and also between the subject and the so-called external. Therefore, how to unmake transcendence? How can the unmaking of transcendence be turned into a positive condition, that is, a condition in itself? The first position to be analyzed is that of transcendence. When I speak of transcendence, I mean a position in which there is a subject that places itself outside the world that it experiences. Transcendence is a form of dualism in which the human subject separates itself from the object. In such a position, the subject transcends the actual world, that is, it places itself beyond the world in which it actually exists. In this sense, every form of experience is a more or less directly a form of transcendence, since experiencing something means separating the one who experiences on the one side and what is the object of the first on the other side. In the very idea of transcendence, there is a dualism, for both in the case of the subject, which places itself outside the object, and in the case of the object, which places itself outside the reach of the subject. It is precisely this dualism that needs to be overcome. But why set the goal of undoing transcendence? Precisely because any form of transcendent experience separates the experiencer from what it is actually being experienced. It is the paradox of experience, because in fact every experience is at the same time a form of connection between the experiencer and the experienced, as it separates them. That is, the very notion of experience presupposes the same separation it seeks to overcome. To experience something is to remove this same something from oneself. For this reason, a production of separation and dualism is inherent in the very idea of experience. In order to deactivate such a dualism, it is necessary to have a certain way of thinking about the concept of expression. In this context, the notion of human animality can play a role. When I speak of animality, I'm not referring to the animality of the non-human animals. Quite the contrary, I'm referring to the animality of human beings, that is, an animality that is completely unknown. In the state of human animality, a state which in many ways requires the humanity of the human to be unmade, expression is no longer a dualistic operation. That is, in such a state, expression is, so to speak, an intransitive state. That is, a state that does not produce dualism and transcendence. It is a non-expressive notion of expression, a non-expressive notion of expression. That is, a form of expression and therefore a form of manifestation on the part of the subject that does not separate it from the rest of the world. If the usual transcendent notion of expression produces the dualism of subject and object, this kind of expression produces something like a subject without subjectivity. That is, a subject that is not separated from the world and life, a subjectless subject, a subjectless subject that fully participates in the life of the world without presenting itself as a separate entity. This kind of entity expresses itself without producing an external communicative or artistic object outside itself. This kind of expression participates in the life of the world. What we need is a form of human-animal mode of expression. This kind of expressivity could be called religious expressivity. It allows the subjectless subject to fully participate in the life of the world. For this reason, I prefer the idea of religious expression to religious experience. In the latter case, there is always a subject who makes the experience of the so-called sacred. It is an experience like any other experience, a situation in which a subject gives something or to or receives something from an external object. Speaking of experience always implies a form of dualism, and it is this dualism that I'm trying to deactivate. On the contrary, since in a religious expression there is no object of experience, it is a situation in which such a dualism disappears. If there is no object of experience, then there is no subject of the experience either. Religious expressivity does not produce separation. On the contrary, it produces connection and participation. More precisely, religious expression is not an experience of someone. That is, it is not the usual dualistic and transcendent form of relation that at the same time connects and separates a subject to and from an object. On the contrary, in a religious expression, the subject deactivates its own subject position as the object of experience, the world, deactivates its own subordination to the subject. In the end, the subjectless subject is nothing other than the world, even if it does not cease to be something singular. It is why I prefer to use the term expression rather than experience, because in the expression, the subjectless subject, even if it is not a self-sufficient entity, still exists. While ordinary communicative or artistic expression simultaneously implies and produces separation, for example, that of meaning ex signifier, or artistic or of artist and artistic work, or subject and object, this kind of expressivity intransitively allows the subject to remain deep into the world. It prevents the subject from withdrawing from it. At the same time, religious expression allows the subject to manifest itself as something existing in itself, while preventing it from establishing itself as a separate and self-sufficient entity. The religious expression creates a bond and a sympathy, while the usual way of looking at the expression pulls the subject away from it. Religious expressions result in a state of absolute immanence, where the distinction between subject and object is no longer operative. A link between human animality and religious expressions is proposed in this talk. Only this kind of subject, a human animal subject, in fact, is a subjectless subject. Such a subject is capable of religious expression. However, before delineating what such a subjectless subject might be, it is necessary to analyze why it is so difficult for the traditional Western subject to participate in religious expression. Western and modern thought about the animal is strictly marked by the radical Cartesian distinction, which establishes the human subject only because, in the same originary gesture, it deprives the human from every animal character. The human is human insofar as it is conscious. The unconscious body, from the moment that it is an animal, is not properly human. The ego cogitans can exist only because there exists a living being that does not cogitate, does not think, the animal. Because there is the animal as the radical other of the human. In this sense, more than the human, Descartes invents the animal as absolute authority with respect to the human. The entire tradition that follows is based on this dualism. What we have called religious expressions requires that such a dualism be put into question. In religious expression, there is no longer a subject facing the sacred, but a subjectless subject expressing itself with its whole self at the same time as it participates in the world. Take the case of someone listening to the sound of sea waves. In this situation, both the one who is listening and the waves of the sea are present at the same time. The idea of religious expression is that while listening to the sea waves, the listener expresses himself at the same time. It is not that he simply receives the sound of the sea, but the sea waves resonate in the listener. So the listener and the sea are both separate at the same time, are both separate and one at the same time. It is why this is a religious expression, because the listener does not stop being a singular entity without becoming a self-sufficient entity. In the religious expression, there is both the listener and the sea, and there is not either the listener or the sea. The possibility of what we have called religious expressions requires for the human being an access to animality, to such an animality that a human being has never experienced before, because humans have never been animals. According to a standard zoological definition, an animal is a multicellular heterotrophic organism that develops from an embryo derived from gametes. Typically, animals are capable of independent locomotion and have sensory apparatus to detect changes in their actual environment. Consider the case of a cat. According to this definition, a cat is an animal because it cannot directly fix carbon for its own growth, so it uses organic carbon. Its body develops from an embryo derived from two gametes. It is capable of independent locomotion. It has a sensory apparatus with which it detects changes in its environment. From a zoological point of view, animal life develops around the body and its actual environment. This is the key point. From a zoological point of view, animal life develops around the body and its actual environment. Animal life takes place precisely in the where and the when of the body. Animal life is completely immanent. If one accepts such a standard zoological definition, it seems quite uncontroversial. A typical member of the species Homo sapiens is not an animal. The key difference is that a typical human life has nothing to do with its actual environment. The cat may be anxious because it smells an eaten dog, or because it does not smell the fragrance of its favorite food. On the contrary, for example, a woman may be troubled by the rumors of a possible future reorganization of the factory where she works, or she may remember her mother who died many years ago. A typical human life extends far beyond its own body, while a typical animal life develops where the body actually is. A typical human life develops forward and backward in time and space. In human life, there is a very deep separation between the body and what such a body can think, hope, remember, and so on. The human body is right here, but its thoughts can be very far away from it in space and time. It is true that animals also have some ability to detach themselves from their own actual environment. But it seems quite undeniable that in typical human life, there is an enormous degree of detachment from the actual environment. Despite the dramatic anatomical and genetic similarities between Homo sapiens and all other living creatures, human life consists of activities and thoughts that do not exist in the rest of the zoological world. Of course, such a statement does not mean that human life is better or worse than, say, cat life. The point is that human life is completely different from animal life. The life of the human being is transcendent in relation to the actual life of the body. Therefore, Homo sapiens is not an animal, at least not in the same sense that a cat is an animal. The main theoretical consequence of such a statement is that human animality is completely unknown. Animality means a life completely and radically at one with itself. Animality means a life without detachment from the actual environment of the body. On the contrary, since typical human life is completely detached from the immediacy of the body, there is no animality in human life. Human life is a zoological life without animality. It is precisely because a human being does not know his own animality that Homo sapiens can be human. I repeat this is a key point of my talk. It is precisely because a human being does not know his own animality that Homo sapiens can be human. The human being is human, the human being at the expense of what he calls his body. The main reason why human beings are not animals is that they speak and are spoken by a language. Language is an apparatus that produces dualism and transcendence. Without some ability to communicate, it seems that no life is possible. Human language, it is used to communicate, but essentially it is not a means of communication. Let us take the case of the cat. Cats respond to the signals of some other cats which live in the vicinity. This means that cats understand a signal as a material entity representing a particular entity in the world, for example, a possible sexual mate. This is a perfect example of animal communication. A sender, a common interspecific code, a signal that means something, a receiver who understands the meaning of such a signal. That is what animal communication is. There is no such thing as a signal to which nothing refers, as in the English words nothing or empty. The key point is that in animal communication, each signal corresponds to a specific entity or action situation in the world. For example, there are no negation signals in animal communication. This means that a cat cannot communicate the message, "There are no dogs." It can only communicate about what actually there is. The absence of signs in animal communication codes that express the logical operation of negation prevent non-human animals from thinking about what is not already contained in their actual environment. This is why a cat seems to be forced to think only about what it directly perceives. On the contrary, language allows human beings to detach themselves from their actual environment. If a means of communication is a code that connects signals to objects in the world, then human language is not primarily a means of communication, because the majority of human language signs do not refer to objects and/or events in the world. The other major defining feature of human language is its own syntax. Let us take the case of the syntactic operator merge. As such, the computational mechanism that constructs new syntactic objects, for example, ate the apples, from previously constructed syntactic objects, ate and the apples. The interesting point is that merge, the operation merge, is recursive. That is, it can be applied to a previous application of the same computational mechanism. Therefore, by applying merge, it is possible to construct a completely new sentence. For example, from ate the apples and drank the water, it is possible to construct ate the apples and drank the water, and so on. There is not such thing as merge in the communication codes of the human animals. The human mind is able to detach itself from the actual environment through the combination of negation and merge. Negation and merge make possible to construct a world completely detached from the actual existing world. Properly speaking, transcendence, that is, the possibility of separating the body from the mind, opens up in human life through the operators merge and negation. The exemplary case of detachment is the detachment of the self in respect to the body. The personal pronoun I is not simply a synonym of the word body. Indeed, I refers to the body as my own body. Therefore, the I and the body are conceived as two entities. The latter an anatomical one, the former a psychological, even though they seem both linked to the same material entity. In fact, the I has a body. That is, the I thinks of itself as something separate from the body, from the animal body. In this sense, the human being has never been an animal, because such a separation of the self does not seem to exist in non-human animals. A cat, or like any other non-human animal, is the totality of the life that it actually lives, no more, no less. A human being is detached from its own body. A non-human animal is coincident with its own life. Language is the computational mechanism that separates the human being from his own life. The language apparatus breaks the animality of the human being. As a consequence, human animality needs a different relationship to language. What is needed is not a language that is transcendent, a language that gives rise to separation and dualism. What is needed is a language similar to that used by cats, a way of expressing rather than communicating, a language of religious expression, a language that expresses the speaker's connection to the world rather than speaker's distance from the world. Let's try to put together all the points that we have been analyzing up to this point. Homo sapiens is a living being that is detached from the world and from life. It is a living being that is detached from the world through the shield of words and thoughts. In this sense, a human being is a transcendent being, because even when he is placed in one place, his mind is displaced elsewhere. A transcendent entity never remains in the place where it is actually located. It is the basic ontological dualism that marks its own life. Homo sapiens is the living being of transcendence. The question is how to imagine a human life that overcomes such a dualism. Animal life is the only life that does not know such a dualism of body and mind. Therefore, the only way to deactivate transcendence is to imagine a human-animal form of life. Such a life would simply stay in the actual world, exactly where it is, without imagining what it could be anywhere else. It is a life of love for the world the way it is, not the way it should be. It is a life expressing a deep love for the way the world is. As Ludwig Wittgenstein said, not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. A life with a different relationship to language is needed if language produces transcendence. What is needed is not a language that communicates, but a language that expresses subjectivity without positing such that subjectivity as a separate and autonomous entity, not as an I. Language as an expression, not as communication. Take the case of the wind rustle through the branches of a tree. Because the tree has no intention of communicating anything to anyone, this is not a case of communication. At the same time, the wind is not communicating with other beings. Such a rustling is nothing more than the impersonal voice of the rustling tree. It is the expression of the tree. In such a rustling, without posing itself as a special and self-sufficient entity, the tree participates with the wind and the world. Without the branches of the tree, would be no rustling. So the presence of the tree is necessary. But for the rustling to occur, the presence of the wind is also necessary. There is the tree and there is the wind. The rustling is an expression of such a relationship between the tree and the wind and the world. Rustling is a religious expression. An expression that does not express anything. An expression that does not express anything. And just close with a nice quotation from story Zen, Joshu's Zen. Joshu began the study of Zen when he was 60 years old and continued until he was 80, when he realized Zen. He fought from the age of 80 until he was 120. A student once asked him, "If I haven't anything in my mind, what shall I do?" Joshua replied, "Throw it out." "But if I haven't anything, how can I throw it out?" continued the questioner. "Well," Joshua said, "then carry it out." Thank you.
Oh, please, someone have questions or something to say about this presentation? Also, people on Zoom, if you want to say something, please push the button and raise your hand so that, or simply put your microphone on and enter in the discussion.
Again,
Yes, Alessandro?
I have a little question. You use a word that is withdrawn at a certain point of your discussion. And this word is the word that Graham Harman used when he talked about object-oriented ontology. For Harman, an object is something that withdraws something in its inner side, something like that. So I would ask you, this transcendence of which you are told is something necessary to overcome the subject, to become a subjectless subject or something like that.
Yes, the idea, exactly this is the idea, that only a subject who does not pose himself as a subject can have such a relationship with vicinity and immanence with the world. So the key point is that the human animal subject, so a subjectless subject, can, for the first time, he can truly have a contact with the world. Since there is the subject, since there is the I, there is always an experience of the world. And experience means transcendence, separation, dualism. So what is needed is a subject that does not pose himself as a subject, as an I. And this subject is what I call a human animal subject. And when such a condition is obtained, then the possibility of a form of relationship with the world is possible. And I call such a possibility expression because I want to preserve something of the subject. So the example of the rustling of the tree and the wind. But at the same time, I don't want to pose the separate position of the subject in respect.
So in the case of Arman, we could say that this withdrawing of the object is something radical, too much radical in respect of what you said before.
The withdrawal of the object is consequent from the withdrawal of the subject. The object is always withdrawing, withdrawalness. The object waits for our step back to emerge and to make it visible.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So we are talking about the possibility of experience or expression in a situation of immanence and lack of subject or subjectivity. And this kind of experience, for example, for me, tomorrow, it will be the artistic practice, artistic expression, artistic experience. And today you talked about religious experience. Okay, maybe someone here could say something more precise about religion in this context, but is it not this kind of expression more mystical than religious, or also because you are referring to Wittgenstein? Or it's the same for you, or also in the religious, that the religion, what I can say.
Okay, grazie. I think that we can speak of religious experience, and when we think of religious experience, I think that we are still inside. We are still into a kind of dualism. So what I wanted to deactivate is exactly such a dualism. For this reason, I prefer I make the reference to Wittgenstein, because in the mystical condition, there is no more such a separation. And while the religious experience seems still a kind of relation between subject and something else. And it is exactly such a separation that I wanted to put into question. And it's the very notion of experience that I find problematic in order to think to the connection to the world. Since there is experience, there is separation and dualism.
And expression too.
This expression in the communicative way. For the artistic question, when I speak of a non-communicative use of language, I'm thinking to poetry. And in this kind of use of language, the aim is not something as communicate something. The aim is the fact of expressing poetry. And I think that poetry is something like the wind through the branches of the tree. It's the human way of participates to the expression of the world.
This is very, very interesting to me. And part of my question is very simple, but
Those are very difficult.
maybe it's for me. I understand this idea of transcendence, the transitive sense of experience, subject, the object created kind of dualism of experience. And I understand your description of the intransitive, exactly communication, intransitive expression, which is kind of pre-experience or pre-event. My question is there ever really a pure participation, loss of self, non-dualistic expression? And is there anything like a totally reflective, objectifying self? Or are these not two ingredients, two elements that are present in all that happens inside the skin-bound mind? Isn't it it's just a question of a spectrum where you're closer to one end than to the other? I mean, even in the most scientific language, there's always gesture at some point. One uses language, and language needs gesture. Even in well, I think you understand the point. Is it really that we're talking about two different pure forms?
No.
Don't exist anywhere, or are they two elements that come together in varying degrees in all of human experience?
For this reason, I use the idea of expression, because I wanted to preserve a position for the subject. Otherwise, there is always the word. It's wonderful that there is the word, but I exist. So I want in some way to preserve a possibility for being something in respect to the world. So the idea of, as you said, a spectrum of possibilities, it's a very, I agree. And I don't think that the condition of human animality can be attained one forever. It's a condition that sometimes happens when you, some way you forget being a human, but you forget. You can forget being human just because you are human. So the idea is that there are moments in life where such a possibility opens up. And in the majority of moments, such a possibility, we are afraid of such a possibility, I think. So the idea is that we are too afraid of such a possibility. So the very idea of human animality is an incredible possibility of a stay at the world, like can stay at the world an animal or a tree or a stone. But I do not forget that it is a human being that is in such a condition. So I completely agree with you.
I have some question or considerations. First, I felt a deep sympathy with your book, with the content of your, and maybe because I'm working on Japanese philosopher, who somehow seems to me very near to some of the point of your presentation. And therefore, the first question is, if you close your talk with a Zen talk between master and disciple. So when you use the word religious, there is a particular affinity with Buddhism, maybe, or you use the concept of religion also in relation with other historical religions. And if so, is simply mysticism that you are searching, or and so is mysticism in every religion the same, or there are some peculiarity so that you prefer, or you quote Zen Buddhism instead of, I don't know, Islamic Sufism or other mysticism? This is the first point. The second point, but maybe is only my bias, is that I hear your presentation, and at the same time, I'm thinking in Japanese. So so your talk is very good, but also very European, in my opinion. For example, the distinction between religion and art is not so simple or so clear in Japan, in Japanese culture. Another point that, for example, when you speak about experience, the word that normally is used in Japanese to translate experience is a word is keiken. And keiken is made by two signs. And worldly means going through signals or going through signs. This is the idea of the experience. So something that could be applied to the animal condition of the cat that go through signs. So the point is, for example, I agree with you that the role of language is the fundamental point. But there are many languages, for example. So there, in Japanese, you have a lot of words to say I. And therefore, I would ask, the second point is, if you are taking in consideration also this the possibility of translation, the concept of the role of translation of interculturality applied to this kind of expression.
In general, I completely agree with you that my starting point was René Descartes, the very deep, strong position of the I, and I agree is not the only way of considering such an entity, but in Western tradition, René Descartes poses the question, and you can imagine, you can reconstruct all philosophy after Descartes as a way of to put together what he separates. And the very idea of animality that I use, it's the contrary of what Descartes says. I think that there are other philosophical and religious traditions that have a different idea of animality. But I work in my tradition, and so I work in tradition that I try to understand. But for example, the concept of animality that I'm using is inside the European tradition. It's a concept that you can find in the Deleuze and Felice Cimatti, and the concept of devenir animal and of becoming animal. That is a way of exactly overcoming the Cartesian distinction. So there are other traditions, for example, not so far from as the Japanese tradition, but in the typical Italian philosophical tradition, the animal is not what Descartes thought about animal. Human being is much more near to the animal in Italian tradition than it was in other traditions. Take the case of this famous, maybe all of us know, maybe you know, the famous moment of life of Francis de Assisi, when he tries to speak to birds. The very possibility to try to speak to birds implies that there is not such a separation between you who speaks and the birds that are there. And you can find a lot of other philosophers that have not such a neat separation between animality and humanity. So up to the second point, I believe that I'm speaking in a tradition. And unfortunately, I don't know your tradition or other traditions. For the first question, similar to Daniela's question, when I think to religious experience, I think to what religious experience is now. Is a place where you have religious experience. It's a moment in life that you can have religious experience. What I'm interested in is a situation where such a distinction is more. So I agree with you that sometimes art experience can be very near to the mystical experience. But what is art now? For example, if you go in a museum is exactly the place where such a religious experience is impossible. So I look for a way to feel such a connection with the world, and such a connection is at the same time mystical and artistic and animal, if you want. And there are no specific places where you can find it. And so the general question is, your talk is about European philosophy. Yes, completely yes. And I know that this is the problem. But I think that all the tradition that at the end of the 20th century philosophy, it's there is a huge movement of opening towards new traditions of, for example, from Asian and so on.
Thank you very much.
China.
Andy?
Thank you for speaking to your speech. One comment, maybe not on the main content, but on your description or your categorization of human and animals. So that your animal is in its body here and now, in a different way from human that typically, where life typically is far beyond here and now, thinking of what has been and what that might be. But I'm curious about this very strict, very clear definition. I'm not sure to what extent this was something you referred to and something you state, but how can we as humans be that sure about what animal actually is?
What?
How can we as humans be so sure about what that animal?
We are not sure. We are not. We are not sure.
For instance, it's easy to see that a dog can think of running while sleeping. Because they're not sleeping, and it actually runs. And also what this so it means that the dog is somewhere else than they're sleeping when it's sleeping. And also personal experience, birds looking for the child 2 days after our cat ate that child of the birds. So there is something. So I'm just curious about the distinction human and animals altered by them thinking and communication. It's made it very, very clear in your expressions.
Yeah, yes. Maybe I'm too Cartesian, but I'm not so. I think that all the I'm interested in difference, not in similarities. So when we try to apply to non-human animals human characteristics, it seems to me that we are not fair with animals. We want them to be too similar to us. Obviously, there are a lot of cognitive competences that non-human animals have, and maybe they are similar to ours. But in the same time, the movement to apply to non-human animals human characters transform animals in quasi human beings and transforms nature in something similar to human. I'm interested in the opposite moment. I want to become similar to tree, not that the tree is similar to me. So I agree with you, and there are a lot of scientific evidences that show that animal cognitive competences are quite high, and that the communicative competences are very, very important. But at the same time, it seems to me that in this way, we transform non-human animals in something very similar to us. And when we think to alien life, I think to a life of the cat, not of something who lives on Mars. So I want to, it is important for me to stress the differences more than stress the similarities. But
Professor Yandela?
You wrote in page 3, in the end, the subjectless subject is nothing other than the world, even if it does not cease to be something singular. But if a subjectless subject is the same as the world, does that mean that the world itself expresses itself? If so, can we rather imagine a hylozoistic world, hylozoismus? Yeah? As a matter of fact, there was a Japanese philosopher who argued as such. He is Shozo Omori Shozo. And his thinking eventually came to recognize something similar to the Japanese kotodama. In other words, language makes the world appear, or more specifically, creates it. Shozo Omori himself wanted to use Wittgenstein to destroy dualism. What do you think about it?
Wittgenstein to destroy dualism.
Yeah.
I agree with you, completely agree with you. I think that Tractatus is a book about it's like a journey from dualism to the completely undoing of dualism. And it's a book about language that constructs the world as a set of objects and relationships. And at the same time, what was interesting for Wittgenstein is to overcome such a. And for this reason, now the seventh proposition, it seems like a Zen proposition. And it says at this point, you do not need any more language to decide how the world must be. It's something like in such a proposition, Wittgenstein says, now you are the world. You can completely be part of the world. You do not need to separate yourself from the world. So I completely agree.
Thank you very much.
See you.
And we can